Freedom of speech, long held by Western media and governments as a virtue, is now just a political tool wielded against foreign nations who pose a threat to US hegemony. Today we'll take a look at the banning of Russian news outlets, the US media's role in the invasion of Iraq and the censorship of opposing voices to that war, and the Western media's continued push to limit free speech when it suits. Let's get reporting. Hello, 大家好，欢迎回到外美看中国，我是安博然。Hey you guys, welcome back to Reports on China. I'm Andy. Free speech has long been held as one of the fundamental merits of Western-style democracy, not just in the US where it's apparently guaranteed by the First Amendment, but all around the Western world. One of the main attacks on China, for example, is that apparently because Facebook is banned here, the population is muzzled. Free speech as a Western virtue, though, was dealt its final blow recently as Western governments and tech giants pushed for the shutting down of Russia's foreign language news outlets, RT and Sputnik. Their claim was that Russian outlets promoted systemic information manipulation and disinformation by the Kremlin. The UK's Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, by the way, that's such an English name, made blocking the channels in the UK a personal vendetta. As part of a concerted effort and discussions, Russia Today is no longer streamed into British homes, she told the House of Commons, before she suddenly remembered that government officials are not meant to have any influence over the media under the West's very own rules. Of course, politicians have absolutely no influence over the free press, and nor should they. Right. Many in the West have heralded the blocking of RT and Sputnik as the right thing to do, despite it going against everything the West apparently stands for. An hilarious New York Times article claims that Russian news is propaganda, while fake Ukrainian news is acceptable because it functions as myth-making and is morale-boosting. In the information war over the invasion of Ukraine, some of the country's official accounts have pushed stories with questionable veracity, spreading anecdotes, gripping on-the-ground accounts, and even some unverified information that was later proved false in a rapid jumble of fact and myth. Should we ban Ukrainian media too then? Of course not. Anecdotes detailing Ukrainian bravery or Russian brutality are crucial to the country's war plan, according to experts. And they're part of established war doctrine that values winning, not just individual skirmishes, but also the hearts and minds of citizens and international observers. This is especially important during this conflict, as Ukrainians try to keep morale high among the fighters and marshal global support for their cause. It's the West who decides what is good propaganda and what is bad propaganda. And it's the West who decides when free speech is important and when it needs to be shut down. Surprisingly though, some voices in Western mainstream media have come out against blatant censorship, including a Washington Post opinion writer who argued, RT is a terrible network, but don't ban it. He says, RT is funded by the Russian government and its editorial line matches the perspective of its underwriters. That's not a secret, but pulling the plug would be at odds with democratic values. He continues, RT is very much a propaganda outlet, but it also offers a worldview informed by insiders with insight into places we wouldn't otherwise be able to see. That's exactly true. In the context of the West, where freedom of speech and expression is meant to be a fundamental pillar of society, these swift moves to block and ban conflicting views, no matter how much you disagree or how those views make you feel, are quite terrifying. Even more scary is the amount of support such censorship seems to have from ordinary citizens. It's painfully ironic that the US and the UK are spearheading moves to block Russian media in light of the Ukraine crisis. Less than 20 years ago, media in the US was specifically used by the administration to boost public support for war as President Bush and Prime Minister Blair invaded Iraq, killing more than 1 million innocent Iraqis. That war was in large part made possible thanks to the media, especially influential media outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post, who literally spread false information to gain public support for the invasion. Media voices who were against the war, on the other hand, were shut up. New York Times journalist Judith Miller was particularly to blame, writing front-page story after front-page story to scare the public into believing that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, something that was completely and utterly untrue, and something that was never, ever backed with credible evidence. The New York Times later admitted that many of her stories were inaccurate and forced her to resign in 2005. But her former colleague, a reporter named James Risen, said in a 2018 interview that Consent for War was manufactured by the entire newspaper, and not just Judith. He said that there was a systemic problem at the paper, which was hungry for stories about the existence of weapons of mass destruction, and that the New York Times wasn't interested in any stories that were skeptical of their existence. Now, does that sound familiar to Western media's thirst for negative Xinjiang stories, despite a glaring lack of evidence? It should. After US Secretary of State Colin Powell convinced the UN that WMDs were ready to destroy the world while holding that infamous fake vial of anthrax, the Washington Post penned a story simply headlined, "Irrefutable." After Secretary of State Colin L. Powell's presentation to the United Nations Security Council yesterday, the column read, "It's hard to imagine how anyone could doubt that Iraq possesses weapons of mass destruction." The supposedly free media of the United States was literally used to manufacture consent for the invasion of Iraq, ending in countless deaths and ongoing suffering. After the invading forces found absolutely zero evidence of weapons of mass destruction, President Bush said he felt terrible, but apparently not for the deaths caused and more for the fact that he was wrong. "I wish we'd have found weapons of mass destruction," he said. Now, wouldn't it be nice if he said something more along the lines of, "I wish we didn't invade and all those people didn't die"? Media voices in the US who were against the Iraq war and not happy to promote it were fired from their jobs. One famous example is MSNBC talk show host Phil Donahue, whose top-rating TV show was given the axe. The reason came out in a leaked memo, which argued that Donahue would be a difficult public face for NBC in a time of war. He seems to delight in presenting guests who are anti-war, anti-Bush, and skeptical of the administration's motives. I think it's very clear now that freedom of speech and freedom of the press are just tools that the West uses when it sees fit, and follows when it sees fit, in order to meet whatever objective it has at the time. Today, as Russian forces remain in the Ukraine, the West has decided to use the weapon of free speech to silence what they call Russian propaganda, while at the same time deciding that Ukrainian propaganda is good and just. In the early 2000s, the media was used in the US to manufacture consent for a war based entirely on bad intelligence and blatant lies. Those who were against the war found themselves ostracized or out of a job. This dynamic has great relevance to China today, which is currently the target of Western government and media lies based on absolutely zero credible evidence. That is the so-called Xinjiang genocide. The campaign against Xinjiang bears the same hallmarks of the Iraq misinformation campaign, where the media is used by Western governments and interest groups to convince the public that there are mass human rights abuses going on, all without any evidence. Anyone who says anything against that narrative is called a propagandist, has their credibility called into question, and is blatantly attacked. This is an information war, and the cards are heavily stacked against anyone who goes against the hegemonic Western narrative.